welcome to week 7 of the course. My name is Richard Nucken Emerson, and today I'm going to talk to you briefly about research. Research is something that you will do in the future in university and also in your professional work. But also, research is something you need to understand in order to write anything that you are going to hand in at university. You will need to reference peer-reviewed articles, much of which are derived from a research report, which was from a research project done by the original researcher. If there's no research, then you don't have any data-based evidence at all. So you need to refer to primary research in most of your papers at university. Firstly, we will just look at what research is. Then we'll look at research reports and how they're formatted. And then we'll look at how you can read a research report to find the information you need. After that, we'll look briefly at reading research articles. Most of what you'll encounter are research articles, which are actually much shorter than research reports. But understanding how the original report was written, even if you never get to see it, is very important, because when you read the article, you're actually reading a much shorter version of the original report. And most of the information is in the same order, just compacted down. So it's important to have an understanding of how a reading research report is laid out and where you can find information. That translates usually into the format for the research articles you will typically use while you're studying at university and in future in your professional work. Often when we hear the word research, it's not really used appropriately. You might say, I was researching for my assignment last night, or last night I was on the internet researching something or other. That is looking into something, and that's a very worthy thing to do, to learn about new things, to read about them. Looking into things and reading about them, though, is not even close to what research is. And I'm not saying it's not worthwhile. In fact, it's possibly more worthwhile to read a lot and to look into lots of things. However, research is a much more involved process. A definition given here frames it well. In the text, Turner et al., the definition of research given is the systematic process of gathering information in order to solve a problem or to answer a question. Seems fair enough. Have a look closely. It's systematic. Now, systematic is another word that gets bandied about. Systematic means through a lengthy process, exhaustive process of peer review. The conductor of the research, the researcher, finds the best way they possibly can with known methods to conduct their research, and their peers critique every draft they make at every stage of their research, well before they even start collecting data. This takes years, which is why research is such a lengthy and involved process. So it's systematic. The other thing is that it will solve a problem or answer a question. Solving a problem you would often connect with something we call action research, where we have a real-life problem that we need to solve. And so we can apply what we find to the problem and keep testing various methods, for example, of solving that problem. Or we might be answering a question, which is more of a theoretical thing, which has just as much, if not more value, because it's, if done properly, it's broadly applicable in increasing our knowledge of an area, which allows us to problem solve across a much larger area. So you're either answering a question or you're trying to solve a problem. A research report is something that is often written but not often read. What you find in academic journals are articles which are summaries of the research reports originally done. The original reports could be hundreds of pages, which isn't practical to publish, and so the researcher becomes an author, and they distill every part of that research report down into an article which is more manageable for your everyday professional or academic reader. A research report is, however, extremely useful, and looking at it is very useful, because the report is the true record of what research was done, and how it was backgrounded, why it was done, and the methods used and why they were used, etc., etc. The results in great detail, or the findings in great detail. It's a very useful document. Now, you might not find an actual research report, but understanding the original research report is essential to understanding what you're reading when you're reading an article in a journal, because it often comes from a research report. So the research report is the original report of the research. It's long and detailed, and you won't see it published. It's mainly for peer review. So the report is written in stages, and peer review is the process by which a group of people who are highly qualified in the same field, peers of the researcher or researchers, read every single section and critique it extremely judiciously and thoroughly, in order to make sure that not one piece of logic, not one piece of evidence, or not one choice of sources or methodology is not accurately or adequately justified. It is also for the purpose of recording the research itself. It's the true record of the research, whereas the article you'll read in the journal is the distilled version, which doesn't contain all the details. It's also an important part of the scientific process. In writing the report, the research is immensely improved, so half the report is written while the data is still being collected. And the writing process of a research report creates meaningful research. So it's necessary as a process for anyone, we could say scientifically, but that could be a sociologist, or it could be a professional engineer, or someone in IT, it doesn't matter who. For them to have a valid academic scientific process, they need to be writing and recording in a very thorough report form, and that's what this research report form is. The research report is formatted in separate sections. Each section will have a heading, and there'll be subheadings. So you'll have, for example, introduction 1, so 1 introduction. Underneath there'll be background, 1.1 background, and then there'll be a next section under that within the introduction, 1.2 something else, 1.3, but there might be subheadings again. So in the background there'll be lots of sections. So you'll have 1.1 background, then you'll have 1.1.1, one aspect of the background, 1.1.2, another aspect of background, etc., etc. Now, these numbered headings are obviously very important for navigating within the document, but also for the writing process and the sanity of the writer, because they allow the writer to break things down into pieces that they can see and they can deal with separately. The same goes for the reader. The reader can come and look at different sections one by one. Without headings, a research report would be without clearly numbered headings, that is, a research report would be extremely difficult to understand. So what does a research report look like? It's generally formatted with title page, executive summary or an abstract, and contents. These usually are obviously not included in the contents, although in some disciplines the executive summary or the abstract is included in the contents. It really depends on what field you're in. So we'll leave that as a moot point. whatever the case, before the end of the contents, everything will be page numbered with Roman numerals. The title page actually doesn't normally contain any kind of Roman numeral, but there are different conventions in different fields, so you've got to follow the conventions of your field. Okay. After the contents, you'll have an introduction, which will have subheadings, background, and so forth. You'll have a literature review, which this is a very, very long part of any research report. It may take years because you need to, or the researcher needs to, look at every single relevant piece of research conducted, every single relevant theory that was created, and needs to compare, evaluate, etc. for all of those. So it's very time consuming. The next process is the development of research questions. These are done after the literature review. Only after reading all the literature can the researcher justify creating their research questions. That's the question or questions that the research report is trying to answer. After that, the researcher needs to develop a methodology by which the research question can be answered. Sounds easy? It's much harder than you think. Even an experienced researcher will go, yep, okay, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. And then when they actually go and try and apply the methodology they planned, and then they're forced to review it through peer review or through, for example, an ethics application, they start to see holes in their methodology, and they need to go down into deeper and deeper detail in order to plug those leaks, if you like. So it's actually very involved. Once the methodology has been clearly established, data can be collected by whatever means, whether it's a survey or observations, experiment, textual analysis, for example. Once that data has been collected, it's reported in the findings or results section. Generally, that's called findings, sometimes results. And then there's the discussion section in which it's discussed. The conclusions are drawn, so all the data is considered in regard to and specifically to answer the research question or questions. After that, recommendations can be given. All research reports have obviously a title page, and after that an executive summary or an abstract, and then the contents in great detail, obviously. This is something you need to do for the final report for 1020 QBT. Please keep that in mind. It's not really consequential to reading the report though. These things are fairly obvious, but the contents are very useful, as you can search through them for subheadings for sections that might be relevant to what you would like to find in someone's research report. So amongst these, you've got contents list for finding detailed information, and you've also got the executive summary, which summarizes the background, why the research is happening, and the findings, or the methodology in fact, so you can identify how it was researched and what type of methods they used. You can also get the basic findings and conclusions as well as any recommendations. They should all be there in the executive summary. So it's really worth reading an executive summary if there is one provided, for example, in a published article in a journal, because it will tell you basically the main points of the report. The first section of a research report is the introduction. It will tell the reader what the topic is and any subtopics that will also be included in that. It will also give a background of why this topic needs to be researched. Now, why is an important question here, and it's probably going to be the same for many of the papers you write at university. The main things about why are significance and has anyone done it before. So why, in this case A, 2A, why is this a significant thing? Why do we need to know about this? If it doesn't have any bearing on anything, then what's the point? So you need to show how this thing you're researching has any connection with life as we know it, or knowledge as we know it. In the next step, the researcher will normally identify a gap in the research in the introduction. They'll need to show that lots has been done in this area about this topic, and in this area about this topic, but no one's done this. And generally the researcher is looking for one little gap. Now that's very important because you don't want a big gap. By that I mean if a researcher charges off into a new direction where no research at all has been done, they are researching in a vacuum. And research in a vacuum has a problem because there's no precedent of other research. It's not just difficult to do, but the results won't have very much meaning because they can't be connected to any other research in that area. So most researchers work incrementally away and slightly around, filling in gaps or working to the outside edges of research that has been conducted to date. Sometimes a researcher will mirror research done by someone else in another place, another time, another context, and they'll just change one or two variables. And so, for example, a person might look into the self-efficacy of American university students. Another researcher might apply exactly the same methodology to the self-efficacy of Indian university students. And while you might say, isn't that plagiarism? It wouldn't be if they correctly show the source of that methodology. They apply the same methodology in another place, and while that requires less imagination, that is actually very worthwhile as research, particularly if the original research was well designed, because what that does is it gives us a great snapshot. This methodology applied in America got this result. This methodology applied, same methodology applied in India, got another result. We can compare apples with apples. However, if someone decides they're going to do their research their way in India, we can't really compare the results of the American and the Indian research. So there's a lot of merit in research being very close to previous research in its design. It doesn't mean it has to be, but there is definitely value in that. So that's why researchers look for a gap. They don't look for wide open spaces. They look for just a little gap that no one's really filled in yet. And that's what they try to do with most of their research. Of course, the introduction will state the purpose or the intention of the report, but it will not give the research questions. They can only be developed after a literature review. Now, you think you know the question you want to ask, but you need to do all the reading to figure out whether that's the right question to ask. So, interestingly, with research, even a very experienced researcher must read extensively before they can even formulate the question. After the introduction comes the literature review. The literature review is perhaps the most lengthy and definitely the most time-consuming aspect of research. That is because it must be an extremely exhaustive review of all previous research or papers or theory that are relevant to every aspect of the topic that the researcher wants to look into. Every relevant paper. Now, obviously, some papers are so dated and no longer relevant that it's not necessary to cover them. But all the seminal ones, the important ones, going back as far as the topic has been researched, should be touched upon. And all the ones that are very similar or are very relevant must be covered in some detail. So it's very time-consuming. The aim is to establish what research has been done before, specifically what research, what methodologies were applied, and any failings of methodology or any points of methodology which were weak or could have been done in a better way, and how each of these research items fits in with others to make a broader picture. Because research on its own is worth nothing. It's how it can be compared or considered in relation to other research results that it becomes useful. The literature review is typically structured by topic. Often a paragraph might begin by extensive description of one particular research or one study by a particular author or set of authors. However, generally there will be subheadings by topic, and there will be subtopics within the main research topic of the research report. So the literature review will have subtopics, and generally they are backgrounding type topics which look into, for example, defining terms, and then previous research investigating more generally, and then more specific research that's relevant to what you're trying to cover in the research report, research project actually. Then the literature review might often address methodologies previously applied, because particularly this is true when various methodologies have been applied, some worked, some didn't, or we're not sure which ones should be applied in this circumstance. And so we need to thoroughly review which methodologies were effective, which were valid, which were reliable, which measurement methods were accurate for the type of data concerned. So that all needs to be dealt with in the literature review. It's a very, very involved process. Now, the other thing about the literature review is when the researcher starts the literature review, they don't know their research question, they don't know their methodology. And so it's the learning process for the researcher. It's essential to their development of their ideas. You will one day do a literature review, and while it's tiring, it's very educative. So the idea is you've got to, the researcher will have a general idea of what they want to research, but they'll actually hone it down to questions by doing a literature review. They'll figure out what kind of methodologies could be used, which ones will work well, which will not work well, which ones will really answer the questions that they're looking into. And also they will find appropriate ways of interpreting the results, because this is also a very involved and particular process. There are various ways that this could be done. So if there's no consistency with previous research, or it's not appropriate to the topic you're covering, choice of results interpretation could lead to success or failure of the research. And finally, the researcher is looking for, broadly, an understanding of the context of their whole discussion. So when they get to the discussion section, they can draw on various related ideas that have come up in the literature, which might be used to add to the data collected to theorize certain ideas, or there might be outstanding questions that could be perhaps considered in the context of the data collected. It might take months or even years to complete a literature review. The literature review has been completed, the researcher can finally write their actual research questions. Again, these are written and rewritten and taken to a supervisor, taken to peers for peer review, and they are developed through a long process of review. They're not just randomly chosen in one evening. So it's a very short section. It might give some short backgrounding behind the questions and why they were chosen. There is typically one main question, and then there are questions that continue on from there. For example, a main question could be, does self-regulation level affect academic performance? That's the main thing we want to know. Can we see a correlation between students having self-regulation and performing well academically. Okay, so beyond that, we think, well, how does that work? So this is the part of the research where we try and get a bit more information out of our data. So the question could be, by what mechanism does self-regulation level affect academic performance? Another question could be, what factors combine with self-regulation in affecting academic performance? There could be a couple more as well. So most research reports have a main question and then some other questions to look more deeply into the reasons why and how of that question that they've originally asked. The importance of a research question or a hypothesis, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how it's different from a research question. The importance of this is, it just cannot be understated. A research question obviously is an important thing, but it really needs extremely deep consideration. And so it guides the research, and also it shows whether the research is actually achieves anything. It's extremely important that it's well designed. If we look at a research question and a hypothesis, what is the difference? The difference is that a research question actually is formulated as a question, such as, why is the sky blue? Whereas a hypothesis might be, the sky is blue due to refraction of light. And then you prove that true or false. As you can see, one is could be an open question, although research questions can be closed, like, does self-regulation affect academic performance? No. Okay, it could just be a simple yes or no. The thing is that with a hypothesis is it can only have a true or false answer. It doesn't allow for any further investigation. Research questions can be expanded upon, particularly if they are why and how questions. Here are examples. A research question would be phrased as a question. What criteria does the average undergraduate use to determine whether a text has been properly paraphrased versus plagiarized? This is taken from Roy. A hypothesis would be phrased more like this: H1, hypothesis 1, and there might be multiple hypotheses for one paper. In any case, hypothesis 1, high initial course grade expectations will lead to increased anxiety at the time of the final exam. True or false? Now, there could be follow-up questions, but generally a hypothesis ends with, oh, it's true, or oh, it's false, or inconclusive. So the hypothesis has, well, it's not as commonly used these days as the research question, because the hypothesis often, and research these days takes a lot more time because it's a lot more involved and a lot more critique, if you like, and peer review is a lot stricter than it was a couple of hundred years ago, in some senses. Ethics review and so forth, this all takes a couple of years. So the researcher wants to make it worthwhile. They'll usually use research questions and follow-up questions so they can dig deeper and deeper and deeper into a topic of why and how and what can we do now and so forth. Whereas if they'd gone from on the basis of a hypothesis, they get the answer true or false, and then they have to design a whole new research project in order to answer the other reasons behind that. Hypothesis to hypothesis is a pretty slow way of researching things. When we talk about a hypothesis, or we talk about a research question, we need to think about what variables are. Variables, if you remember your algebra, would be the letters used in mathematics to represent, well, something that could be any number at all. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, for example. A could be any number you like. So that would be a variable. A constant, obviously, is something that doesn't change, such as pi, for doing calculations around a circle. 3.141492653, blah, 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 blah. So we have other constants such as gravity, and other constants that I can't really think of at the moment. But variables are all those numbers that could be anything. So with a variable, we need to express what it is. And if you look at the examples down the bottom, we have two variables here: initial course grade expectations and anxiety at the time of the final exam. Now here, we're going to talk about language just a little bit. Most of you are used to seeing a variable in algebraic terms. It could be x or y or a or b or c or theta. However, you might not be used to seeing it in grammatical form. This is very important because it's the key to academic writing. Academic writing is basically identifying variables and connecting them in meaningful ways. Here we have the variable initial course grade expectations. This is a noun phrase. Please remember that, noun phrase. The noun phrase contains a noun, expectations, and then it has modifiers of that noun. Now, the expectations are in relation to grade. Grade's also a noun, but in English you can use it as a modifier, like an adjective. We get this from German, by the way. You can't do this in French or Spanish or Portuguese or Italian. You're not allowed to use a noun to modify another noun. What's that? But you can in the Germanic languages, and we took that from Germanic languages. So we can say grade expectations. For example, if we were speaking French, we'd have to say expectations in regard to grade, or of grade. Okay, so yeah, lucky for us, we're using English, and this is very helpful because we can just put a noun in front of a noun. Now, we've got expectations in relation to grade. Grades for what? Course. So we have a noun, course, another noun, grade, another noun, expectations. Expectations is modified by grade. Grade is modified by course. So it's the expectations in relation to the grades of a course. Lucky for us, in English, it becomes course, grade, expectations. 3 little words. If you were to do this in Spanish, Italian, it would be much more complicated. So if you've studied in any of those Latin languages, French included, you would know that this would require lots of other language to be put in there. It would be less efficient, and then you're getting further away from your word limit. Yeah. So you can see this is very useful for sticking to a word limit, but also it's useful for neatly packaging an idea. Course, grade, expectations. That is what it is, and that will come up many dozens of times in the report. Course, grade, expectations. Can you use that word? Yes, you can. It's not, or that phrase. Yes, you can. It's not plagiarism to use that. It becomes a set phrase, if you like. As long as you're not ripping off their sentences, you can't be doing that. But you can use that term, course, grade, expectations, when you're reporting on someone's report and their findings in regard to that. Okay, now there's one other word in there, initial. This is an adjective. So you can see you've got a noun modifying a noun modifying a noun, and then you put an adjective in front of it and modify that. You could even put an adverb in front of that. You could put counters, many or several, and so on. These make the noun phrases that create what we know as technical and academic language. It's not a style, it's just a practical way of doing things. Similarly, the other variable, anxiety at the time of the final exam, is another noun phrase. Now this one is written using prepositions at, of, and so also it's separating the nouns out, so then you need the articles, the time, the final exam. As this goes as a noun phrase, it's less efficient. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but in terms of word limit, if you have one to write, it would be more challenging. Could you possibly make this into a shorter noun phrase using the same method that we used for initial course grade expectations? Yes, you could. It could be, for example, time of the final exam anxiety, for example, as long as it was made clear. So these are the variables. What's important in research is that they use the same term again and again and again to talk about the same variables. If you start using another term, then the reader doesn't know if we're talking about the same variable. So by definition, academic writing is monotonous. It's repetitive in the use of nouns. So everything your teachers told you in high school is not wrong, but when writing academically or professionally or technically, there's one thing that is definitely not useful, and that was the rule your teachers gave you of never use the same word twice. That one, I won't say throw it in the rubbish bin, I'll just say put that one away for a while, because it definitely doesn't help you when you're writing in the sciences or if you're writing in university in general. Never use the same word twice is great for fiction and journalism, for being interesting. However, and for showing your vocabulary and your language skills. However, it's not helpful in academic writing where you're trying to be consistent and clear. So once you have defined initial course grade expectations, you use the same expression again and again throughout the whole report. That's just how we write. It works because we don't feel confused as a reader when we start reading other choices of wording for the same idea. Okay, so keep that in mind. There are reasons why the variables have been phrased certain ways, and for that reason you can use the same phrasing. The methodology section of a report, often summarized to a very short section once published in a research article in a journal, generally very long in the original report. It says exactly how data will be collected. It talks about the research approach developed through the literature review. So it's not just a random choice of data collection. It has to be justified within the literature review. And if it's not, peer reviewers will tell tell the researcher, go back and do it again. It's designed extremely carefully to answer the research question, and even then it's turned back by peer review numerous times by a supervisor, for example, if it's a PhD. And the researcher must work on their research questions again and again until they actually come the closest possible to answering the research question with current knowledge. Okay, so reading the methodology is very useful for you because you can see, for example, are there any weaknesses in the research? How was it conducted? Were the methods used valid in testing a certain idea? Did they really provide data that could answer the research question? Did they collect it in a reliable way? And was the data measurement an accurate measurement? So these are things that you can consider when you're reading research. And all research you read, you should be critiquing. You shouldn't be reading it just believing it. You should be critiquing it with a scientific mind. Otherwise you're not really understanding the research. Now let's talk about methodology more generally here. This is something that you really need to understand about all research. The first thing is that research can collect data, or it can use the data from other people, or it can look at numerous other research projects that have been conducted in the past. This is the difference between primary research, where data is collected by the researcher. Findings are then reported and then discussed, etc. Or secondary research, in which no data is collected, and there'll be a literature review and there may be data, for example, used from another person's research. However, no data is actually collected by the researcher in secondary research. Please remember that distinction. The next distinction that you need to know is the difference between quantitative or quantitative, two different ways of saying the same thing, and qualitative. So quantitative data is numerical. It can be expressed as a number. And qualitative data cannot be expressed as a number. So it's descriptive. It talks about qualities. Surveys will bring numerical data. Now the questions will be in words and the answers will be in words, but those words can be set out so that consistent answers will be given. For example, using a Likert scale of agree, for example, disagree, somewhat disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, agree. You've probably seen that before. It's called the Likert scale. That is an example of qualitative ideas, words, thoughts, being brought down to a number on a scale. Disagree being, for example, 1, and agree being 5. And from that, quantitative data can be used and processed in various ways. Some observations can be made in a quantitative way in that they can be counted, like if different observations are given different names and categories, they're categorized and then they're counted. Observations are made and counted, and those numbers are then used. That's quantitative. Similarly, textual analysis, where we analyze text, video, people's conversations or so forth, these are analyzed if certain categories of utterance or behavior are created and then counted, then this is quantitative data. It's numerical. Now, qualitative data is often what we get from interviews, where the conversation is so complex that categories cannot be made. That is not to say that an interview cannot be used for quantitative data, because certain answers could be categorized and numerous people could be interviewed. However, you have to keep in mind that quantitative data is only useful if many people are chosen, or many things are chosen to investigate. Qualitative data is very different in that it, by its nature, requires deep understanding of individual subjects. So there'll be non-countable observations or non-countable textual analysis of conversations, and these will be written down as qualities, not as numbers. And this allows the researcher to dig deep into the what is happening and why. The thing is that qualitative research often only allows the researcher to deal with 5, 6, 7, 8 subjects, whether they're people or other things, whereas quantitative allows, through effective use of surveys and so forth, the surveying of hundreds, if not thousands of people. And in fact, quantitative data is not useful unless you do that, and it's fully randomized. Qualitative data is different in that it may not be randomized, but it doesn't claim to represent everyone. So generally, quantitative data, numerical data, is used to try and gain an understanding of everyone in the target group. You're trying to understand a whole group of people, you select a group of them, a sample, and then you take quantitative data, numerical data from them. You need to talk to a lot of them, or you need to interview or observe a lot of them, or whatever. It might be things, or it might be animals, or it might be plants, it doesn't matter. You need to have a lot of subjects to study, and then you can get some quantitative, numerical data. And then you can understand a generalized view of how every one of those people might do things. Whereas qualitative doesn't tell you that. It can't say, this is what all these people do, or what this group of people does this, or this group of plants does this, or this group of animals does this. It doesn't allow that at all. Qualitative data only allows us to say, people within this group might do this. They can do this. We've seen that some of them do this. We don't know if it applies to all. Either camp arguing that one is better than the other is fairly useless, because both forms of research are equally useful as well as equally flawed, imperfect. Quantitative tries to be generalizable but never really can be, And qualitative is not generalizable and says it does understand some subjects in great detail, but it can't be used to really say what everyone does. So each of these approaches has their limitations. It's very important when you look at a piece of research to understand whether it's primary or secondary, quantitative or qualitative. If you don't understand that, then wow, you really haven't got a grip on that research paper. Yeah. So these are the first things you should identify in a paper. And you'll see this in the methodology. The methodology will generally address what the sample is, what the data collection instrument is, and what procedures in detail are followed. So the sample is the small group from the target population that the researcher is interested in. So you're interested in the target population, but you can't talk to all of them because there's hundreds of thousands of them, and so you take a small group. Or there's a certain type of plant you want to look at, but you can't look at all the plants, you can only look at a sample of them. Are all plants the same from the same species? No, they're not, but you can get a sample of them, and a reasonable sample is of a certain size. Of course, peer review is there, sitting down with peers, is there to establish what kind of size of sample and how that sample is taken is appropriate. Okay, data collection instrument is how data is collected. Is it a survey? Is it observation? Is it experimenting? Is it textual analysis, etc., etc.? And the procedures are what you will actually do to collect data. So this is every single step, and if you've ever had to do this, you think you've done it, but then someone reads it and go, yeah, but what happens here and what happens here? Particularly when it goes to ethics review, there are so many questions, it definitely hones the procedures. And the procedures take a long time to develop. I mean, exactly how are you going to find people to participate in a survey, for example, on the internet? Exactly how are you going to do that? Every last step has to be described, so it's quite involved. Let's have a look at what a sample can look like. Here we have a target population, people attending a live gig, in old terms, a rock concert. Obviously this is a large venue, probably a stadium with people way up the back, maybe 20,000 people in this stadium, or 30,000 people, maybe more. If you look at them, you can see a few people making signs with their hands that indicate it could be a Metallica concert or something similar. Okay, so here we have a sample in the bottom right, and you could choose this group of people to try and understand what everyone is experiencing in this stadium. Think about it for a sec. How many people are in the sample? Less than 20. Less than 20 people to represent, what, 30,000 people? Is that reasonable? Moreover, there's another problem with this sampling. Can you see what it is? All these people are, that's right, they're up the front. This photograph has been taken by a professional photographer in, between the fold-back speakers and the security, and probably just outside the wire mesh. Okay, so these people are, well, they're in the best position to see the band, so they will probably report on it being very enjoyable, and they probably don't care about the sound quality because they're feeling the energy of the band up close. What else can we say about these people? Well, some of them are there by coincidence and as a result just happen to be having a good experience being up the front, which is always nice. But let's think about who wants to be up the front, the most keen people, or who pushed up here from somewhere back in the stadium and they just found their way through the mosh pit right up to the front. They are the keenest, and the guitarist could fall flat on their face halfway through the gig and they could still say it was a great gig because they're keen. So if you talk to these 20 people here, you're probably not going to get a representative answer for everyone in the stadium. So how could you sample everyone in the stadium? Do you wait outside and interview the first 400 people who come out? But then you'd have certain selection bias in that the people who came out first might have been the ones who didn't enjoy it as much, and the ones who really enjoyed it wanted to stay there and soak up the ambiance, the atmosphere after the concert. Okay, so you change tactics and say, okay, we'll stand outside the entrance and then we'll pick every 20th person. Okay, that's getting a bit better. However, when you choose someone from a moving crowd, some will stop and some will not stop. And again, this will bias your results. It's actually extremely hard. No, actually, I'll rephrase that. It's impossible to get a random sample. There are various ways of attempting to get true randomization, and we'll look at those in 2 slides ahead of this. The main point is that choosing a sample is more than just choosing the first 20 people in front of you. That's actually called the convenience sample. It's sometimes used in qualitative research, but qualitative research is good in it's honest. It says, we chose a convenience sample. We know this doesn't represent everyone in the target population, but it does represent some. So we at least know that some people think like this and tend to do this, etc., etc. Okay, so let's just review this sampling process. The group of people or things that you want to understand would be the target population. So the researcher identifies a group they are trying to understand. That's indicated in pink in this simple Venn diagram. From this, they'll choose the study population, the population of things or people that are actually accessible to them, from which they can select someone. So if I wanted to understand university students in Australia, it's not very likely that I could travel the whole country in order to collect my data. So I might choose a study population along the East Coast, for example, in the major cities that I can access. But then there are other problems with that. I'm only looking at city universities. So maybe I'd choose some regional, some city universities, but then there'd be some limitations of, I couldn't probably afford on a researcher's grant to fly over to Perth. So my study population is the group that I actually have access to. Now from that, I can't choose every single one. I still have to choose a sample from that. So that's the actual sample. This is the group of people or things that are selected for research. So it could be, for example, 3 regional and 3 city universities on the east coast of Australia, and the study population is universities on the east coast of Australia, and the target population was universities throughout Australia. And it was just that group that was accessible to me and that sample that I took from it. Now, with sampling, it's very important, in particular with, in any case, but in particular with quantitative research, where numbers are produced and the aim is to make generalizable data that talks about the general study population that we can use to say, well, we're pretty sure that this is the general tendency amongst the population. Now, with qualitative research, just looking at qualities of a small group, not necessarily randomly chosen, we don't generalize that because it can't be generalized. Whereas quantitative research, dealing with accountable data in numerical data, is really only useful if it can be generalized. So the general rules are that if a sample is not probability, so is random or non-random, probability is random. So if it is non-random, then you cannot generalize to the target population or to the study population. So the problem there is that it hasn't been chosen completely randomly or in a systemized randomness, and the selection bias of the researcher will mean that you haven't really figured out your actual target population and what they really want or do or think. You haven't got a true indication of what they do because there were biases in the choice of sample. Similarly, a sample may be too small. 316 undergraduate students cannot generalize to all undergraduate students, so you need to be sufficiently random and have sufficient number of samples or participants, depending on whether animal, mineral, human, and that is what allows the data to be generalized and to say what people in general or things in general do. So this is very important for quantitative research. There are various examples of random choice of participants for a sample. It could be simple random, literally like the rolling of a dice. There could be a system to it in order to avoid selection biases or reduce selection biases. For example, if I were to stand in the middle of Griffith University and say, I'm conducting a survey, who would like to answer? Some people would confidently say yes, and other people would say no. Now, this could come down to, for example, my gender, my age, my height, my demeanour. This would affect who would say yes and no. For certain cultural reasons, women of certain countries would, of course, feel uncomfortable stopping at the behest of a male they've never met before. This is just one of many different cultural reasons which would make this a non-random method of doing things. So just trying to do things in a simple random way often doesn't produce a truly random result. So we create systems. For example, we decide that, well, there'll be two people who will do this job. One is collecting data, one male, one female. Also, they will go to various places in the university and have different approaches. We'll also use an online survey. We'll also use some other method to collect data. Because some people just don't like stopping in the middle of the university square or in the middle of the street to talk. Some personalities don't like to do that, and so you would miss their opinion by having a simple system. So systems are created to not create more randomness, but to make the randomness more representative of the group. Similarly, we have stratified random samples, to obtain a sample of each strata of a population. Then there's multi-stage and multi-phase, taken over different times or periodically at short times, or phases which are overlapping. There are cluster samples, etc. So these are all designed to be random, but to try to represent the target population, because you can't actually do it perfectly. You can only try the best you can. Each group is slightly different, and so different systems, stratification, or stages, or phases, or other methods are used. Now, a convenience sample or a purposive sample quota are non-probability samples, and they can't be used to generalize. So you can't choose in these two ways and then generalize and say, oh, well, then in the target population, people tend to think like this. That can't be used like that. This is generally for qualitative data. So convenience sample is literally choosing the ones who are most available. This could, for example, if you're studying sea lions, you happen to catch 7 sea lions. Then you study the 7 sea lions. So that's a convenience sample. A purposive sample quota would relate to a specific group within the target population, and so it's sort of aimed at with a particular purpose in mind. Again, it's not random. So we've just talked about methodology in great detail. I hope that you can take some of these concepts away. You might be a little bit bewildered by all this terminology, but it's very important that you have a concept of primary research, secondary research, quantitative versus qualitative, and then the process of finding, target population, study population, a sample from that, how that sample can be chosen, the degree of randomness, and how this makes research valid or invalid, or reliable or unreliable. Now, moving on from there, you would find that any research report would have a findings or results section, generally called findings. Now, the findings only report on the results of the data collection, and there's no discussion or interpretation. There might be a little bit of processing, and that would be detailed in the methodology, but basically the findings just report what the methodology has produced in terms of data. Discussion is where the researcher discusses and interprets the data in order to answer the research questions. So they get the data, they get the research questions, and they try and get some answers. It discusses how this relates to the literature more briefly. It raises any unforeseen new topics for future research, and also any issues in the data collection, any validity, any reliability or accuracy problems that were found. And obviously this is to be used later on to give recommendations on how research could be done better next time. A research report will obviously have a conclusion section and a recommendation section. Sometimes they're rolled together, or recommendations are just included within conclusions. The conclusion will summarise the results and discussion while addressing the research questions. It'll raise any further research requirements, and it will note any shortcomings in the research, from literature review all the way through to interpreting the results, and it will analyse anything that could have been done better, and it will mention that. Recommendations will give recommendations on any action required on the basis of this research. Now, not all research requires an action. Certain types of research, however, are designed to establish what should be done, such as action research or research within industry. And so, generally, industry reports will have recommendations on what we need to do now, based on the research conducted. The last thing you'll find in recommendations are recommendations on further research required, how it should be done, and how that could be improved on this study and previous studies. So when you're looking at a research report or an article based on a research report, where can you find information? There's the literature review, and obviously there's findings, but probably you can get more information out of the discussion, where the actual meaning of the findings or results is discussed. It tells you the answer to the research question. You could also look into the research questions section. What are the research questions, so you know exactly what they're trying to establish? And you also would want to look at the methodology, in particular their sample, how they choose a sample, what methods were used of data collection, and how was the sample drawn together. And you should be using critical thinking to consider whether the sample provided any bias in the results, which should be considered. And you could also consider whether there were other options for methodology. And you might want to question while you're reading the researcher's choice. You could also think about the quality of the peer review. At times peer review is great, and other times, rarely, but at times, peer review doesn't seem to be as thorough as it should be, and this is something you should try and pick up on. So this is the part, reading research articles, where you say to me, yeah, Rich, okay, I haven't found a single published article that looks like anything you've shown me above. And I'm not surprised, because you probably won't find that. Very rarely do full research reports actually make it to any kind of publication where it can be read widely. It's usually only for very specific audiences. And what happens after that is the researcher writes a summarizing paper, and that paper is then sent to academic journals, goes through peer review obviously, and then is sent to academic journals, and the academic journals decide whether to print it or not. So what you're actually reading is a very, very short version of a very, very long piece of writing. The research report could be 400, 500 pages, whereas the article really could only be maybe 4 to 12 pages in a journal. So the research article in an academic journal is a summary of the original full research report. You won't have the clear sections with the numbered headings. While there are not report-style headings, there may be headings for concepts. Particular ideas might be given headings for sections of the document, as we've seen in some of the readings so far in the course. Okay, the other thing that is very useful to know is that the research article, as published, usually is in the same or very similar lineal order as the original report. So the original report will be in the format I showed you above, introduction and backgrounding and literature review and developing the questions. Generally, the information is in the same order in the article, but not as much detail is gone into. The discussion section obviously is generally fairly, maybe not similar size, but it's emphasized because it's the most important part in the publication of a research article. In general, you'll find that it's much, much shorter, and you might even be a bit frustrated that certain information isn't available to you. So when you're looking at a research article, what can you get out of it? You can find out what research they did, what were they trying to investigate and how they did it, how it was done in terms of methodology, and you can find any weaknesses in the methodology. You should be looking, because there are always weaknesses in methodology. Does that mean that the whole research report or the article published is useless? No. All research has faults. There are things that can't be foreseen, and there are also limitations to what we can actually do. The most important thing is to understand what the limitations of that particular piece of research are, so that when you're using it, you can know to what degree it can support your arguments and whether you'll need other support. And also you can indicate in your writing that you understand that there are misgivings in the research. It isn't perfect, this research that you found. However, it's still very useful. And so you might say, while there were some reliability issues in their study, McFerrin and Jones still found a fairly strong indication that blah, 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 blah was true. And so you're showing the reader that when you write like this, the researcher is showing the reader, I have read this very critically. I'm not just taking it hook, line, and sinker. I'm critically analysing this as I'm writing it, but still it seems to me that on balance a lot of it can be used as a takeaway, and that's what I'm presenting to you now. And so that, as the reader can read that and they can trust the writer, knowing the writer has been sufficiently critical of the original report they're reading. Okay, so what was found, what was recommended, and any leads to other research. All of these will be in research articles. You don't need to find the original report to get this information. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, I'm finishing off here. What I'd like you to do is to use the knowledge I've discussed here, and as you're reading to prepare for your assessments in this subject and every other subject, I'd like you to remember that what you're doing is actually completing secondary research a lot of the time. And so you need to have this critical eye, and I want you to have a critical thinking mind happening whenever you read any articles, wherever you've sourced them, and think about all the methodologies that have been used. Is there adequate reporting of how data was collected and so forth? And you should be critiquing in your mind each of these papers as you read them. In particular, you'll need to do this for the coming presentation and report for 1020 QBT. And moreover, the report requires you to have a very similar structure to a research report. Lucky for you, and for me, for the report you do not need to do any data collection. So it's not primary research, it's secondary research. And you're expected to have a research mind when you find articles and use them in your writing. It shouldn't be just a simple case of having a simple argument and going out and finding something to support you. You should be actually learning as you read about the topic and keeping an open mind and allow the research to teach you. But then don't allow the research to lead you. You've still got to come back to the focus of what you're trying to achieve in your final report. Okay, so you'll need this knowledge for researching the presentation and report, and I hope this lecture has been useful for you.